afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Charity Village webinar. We will get started in just a moment. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to join us before we begin the session. We have people tuning in from across the country today, which is excellent. It's so nice to have all of you here. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's Charity Village webinar. My name is Mercedes, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager with Charity Village. As we are gathering here on a virtual platform, it is important to acknowledge that each of us is joining this webinar from the ancestral or unceded lands of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people. I'd like to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation. Please join us in a moment of reflection as we recognize the Indigenous peoples as the stewards of this land. Let's acknowledge the mistakes and harm in our history and the ongoing injustice, and contemplate tangible actions each of us can take to move forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. For those who may be joining a Charity Village webinar for the first time, Charity Village is Canada's largest online job board for the nonprofit sector. In addition to our online job board, organizations can also post volunteer positions. So if you're looking for work or to recruit talent in the sector, Charity Village is a great place to start. We also have a ton of excellent resources for nonprofit professionals, including online courses, articles, fundraising tools, and free webinars like the one we are presenting today. Before we start today's webinar, I would like to quickly run through some housekeeping items. You may have noticed when you joined the webinar that you were automatically put on mute. Since we have hundreds of participants in today's session, it is important for us to minimize the amount of background noise so that everyone can clearly hear the presentation. But you can still ask questions and make comments using the question box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel. Look for that at the bottom of your screen. You can also email your questions to webinars@charityvillage.com. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions as you think of them, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. If you happen to encounter any technical issues with the webinar, please let us know in the question box or by sending us an email. We will do our best to get any technical difficulties resolved as quickly as possible, but in a worst-case scenario, please remember that we are recording today's webinar, and we will send you the full recording by email tomorrow. So if you get called away or disconnected, you will still be able to view the full presentation. Now I would like to welcome our presenters, Jeff and Jack from the Portage Group. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much, Mercedes, and hello, everyone. It's great to have you joining us today for the 2025 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Study Highlights webinar presented by the Portage Group and Charity Village. Today, we'll be walking through the key highlights from this year's study, looking at what's changed, what's remained consistent, and what these results tell us about compensation and benefits across the nonprofit sector in 2025. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to tell you a bit about us, give you an overview of the study and who participated, review some high-level compensation findings, provide some insights into how to use the data, and we'll wrap up with a discussion on sector and compensation trends to help you make the case in today's environment. As Mercedes noted, we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions as we go, please type them in the question area, and we will do our best to address as many as we can before we close. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Portage Group is a full-service management consulting firm focused on the distinct needs of the not-for-profit sector. Our team has worked with over 300 associations, regulators, and charities across Canada, helping organizations in the areas of market research, strategic planning and organization design, and executive recruiting. Our research team has conducted hundreds of projects, including over 50 compensation studies for organizations such as Charity Village and the Canadian Society of Association Executives. I'm Jeff Thacker, Executive Partner of Research at the Portage Group and one of its founding partners. I've been conducting research for more than 30 years, leading projects of all kinds, but for the last 25 years, my focus has been almost entirely on associations and other nonprofits. Among the hundreds of projects that I've led, I've conducted dozens of compensation studies, including all 10 of CharityVillage's national salary and benefit studies going back to 2011. And before working in this sector, I worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I played a lead role in their market research practice. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jack to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and good day to everyone. I'm very happy to be on today's webinar and look forward to sharing information on compensation tips and trends for the coming year. My career has primarily been in the not-for-profit sector, whether leading organizations as the employed chief staff person or helping clients as a management consultant. I've been on the volunteer side of the board table too. My focus in consulting is executive search, as Jeff noted, leading highly successful research-driven projects to find the right candidates to take organizations to even higher levels of performance. Back to you, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Jack. And now for a bit of background on the study. Data was collected through a variety of channels in March of 2025. In total, 963 not-for-profit organizations participated in the study. Each survey allowed respondents to provide compensation and benefits information for an unlimited number of individual staff members, grouped into 6 staff levels. Altogether, the data set includes almost 4,600 position profiles, representing over 12,000 individual staff across the sector. While we will be focusing primarily on compensation findings today, the report also includes a detailed analysis of benefits offered in the sector. Before getting into the results, it is important to take note of a few study limitations. Compensation findings or figures are as of March 2025. Results are based on the survey responses and are only as accurate as the data provided by survey participants. The survey was distributed through CharityVillage's subscriber list, webinar participant list, and social media channels. So it's not a random sample. As such, while the results provide an excellent snapshot of the sector, they may not fully represent the entire nonprofit landscape in Canada. Additionally, professional and trade associations and foundations were generally excluded from the study so as not to skew the data. The overall results are very robust. However, data for smaller segments should be interpreted with caution due to smaller sample sizes. So who participated in the study? Well, consistent with previous studies, just over half of participating organizations were headquartered in Ontario, while BC accounts for just over 1/5. At 14%, Alberta was also well represented. 7 in 10 were registered charities, and a significant 4 in 10 respondents represent local organizations. Regional, provincial, and national organizations each account for just under 1/5 of responses. And the range of staff and budget size, as shown here, indicate that there was also a good mix of organizations by size. While many components make up an organization's overall compensation package, by far the most common benchmark is cash compensation. Unlike other components, the value of cash compensation is straightforward. It's easy to compare from one employee or position to another. Over the next few slides, I'll provide a high-level summary of cash compensation results. For those who'd like to dig deeper, you'll find much more detail in the report, including specific benchmark comparisons. Let's start with a summary of cash compensation by staff level. The teal bar represents the average base compensation, while the small sliver of orange represents the average bonus cash compensation. Not surprisingly, cash compensation generally increases with seniority. And as seen here, chief executives in 2025 earned, on average, $126,000, of which $123,800 is in the form of base compensation. Level 2 senior executives are slightly lower at an average of $119,800, followed by level 3 senior management at 98,300. After that, there's a significant drop off to level 4 at 72,700, and non-management staff, which are at 51,100 to 54,200. Consistent with previous years, bonus cash does not represent a significant portion of compensation in the sector. In fact, only 12% of participating organizations reported offering a formal incentive plan to at least one staff level. Chief executives are the most likely to receive bonuses, with 16% reporting that they have this type of compensation. Senior executives are next at 14%, followed by senior management at 11% and management supervisory at 9%. Across all chief executives, including those that do not receive a bonus, the average incentive compensation is 1.1% of base salary. But if we look at only the 16% of chief executives that participate in an incentive plan, the average paid is 7.3%. Similarly, for senior executives, the average is 0.8% for the sector as a whole, and 5.8% among just those who receive the bonus. Senior management is similar, and for management, supervisory, and non-management staff, the sector-wide average, including those that do not receive a bonus, is 0.3% or less. When looking at only those that receive this type of compensation, the average ranges from 2.3% to 3.3%. So how has compensation changed over time? Well, from 2024 to 2025, average compensation increased at 5 of the 6 staff levels. The largest increase was for chief executives, up 7.1%, followed by senior executives at 5.2% and senior management at 3.1%. Increases were more modest for management and supervisory staff and functional and program staff at about 1% or less. And following a significant 14.9% jump in 2024, support staff saw a slight decline of 1.5% this year. Well, it's easy to focus on the year-to-year shifts. The longer-term trend gives a clearer picture by smoothing out some of the study-to-study peaks and valleys. Over the past 9 years, compensation has been rising at an average of 1.3 to 3.3% per year, depending on staff level. The fastest rising levels over that time have been support staff and chief executives, both increasing by just over 3% per year on average. For context, inflation in Canada from 2016 to 2025 averaged 2.8% annually, though that rate was skewed upwards by the high inflation period between 2021 and 2024, which averaged 4.6% and peaked at 8.1% in mid-2022. Looking at the more recent period since December 2020, Consumer Price Index has increased by a total of 18.1%. During that same time, average compensation benchmarks have risen by 15 to 27% across all levels, meaning that most staff levels have kept pace or even exceeded inflation, with the exception of management supervisory staff. So let's take a closer look at how compensation in the not-for-profit sector compares to inflation. To assess this, we'll compare the growth using a common index starting at 2013, and the thick black line represents inflation. It shows that if you were paid $100 in 2013 and received raises equal to inflation, your pay would have increased to $133.20 by 2025. For a total gain of 33.2%. Now let's add chief executives to the graph. For a chief executive who received an increase every year equal to the growth in the average benchmark from 2013, Their compensation would have been generally increasing in step with inflation up to 2020, though there was a bit of gap between the lines in 2020 or in 2018 before syncing up again in 2020. In the last 4 years, chief executive compensation has played catch up. The trend line suggests that the increases were reactionary to the rapid inflation in 2021 and 2022, and chief executives are now ahead of inflation. So for a chief executive making $100,000 in 2013, they would be earning $139,000 or $139,600 in 2025. That's about $6,400 or 5% more than if their increases were based on inflation alone. We see a similar story for the other two senior management levels up to 2023. Though for level 3 senior managers, average compensation was consistently falling behind inflation from 2013 to 2020 before starting to really climb. However, neither of these levels experienced the same jump as chief executives since 2023, and as a result are roughly 1.5 to 8.5 points lower than inflation in 2025. Now, while it weaves above and below the inflation line, the average compensation for level 4 management supervisory generally tracks with inflation. For the non-management levels, support staff compensation was delayed, but did experience a rapid increase in 2024 to catch up to inflation before regressing just below inflation in 2025. And while level 5 experienced significant increase in 2025 to play catch up, it lost ground again in 2025 and is well behind the pace of most levels. We don't know what inflation will be like over the next 10 years, but if you look back, you will see that from 1993 to 2020, inflation in Canada averaged 1.75%. The highest inflation rate in that span was 2.9% in 2011, and it is now back down below 2% in 2025. So while the gap increased in 2022, history does suggest that over the long run, nonprofit compensation will generally experience market corrections to line up with inflation. Now let's take a look at only the recent volatile period using 2020 as the base year. This allows us to better assess how the sector adapted to the rapid changes in inflation in the past 5 years. Again, the thick black line represents inflation. It shows that if you're paid $100 in 2020 and received raises equal to inflation, your pay would have increased to $120.40 in 2025 for a total gain of 20.4%. Now let's again add the chief executives to the graph. And while chief executives fell behind in 2021, they caught up to inflation in 2024 and surpassed it in 2025. So from 2020 to 2025, the average chief executive compensation increased by 26.9% compared to 20.4% inflation. While the pattern to get there varies by level, all levels except for level 4 are close to inflation in 2025. Level 4 did see some catch up, but still sits 5 points behind inflation in 2025. It's important to note that the changes in average compensation for the sector does not necessarily mean that individual employees are seeing those same changes. The change in the sector average reflects all the promotions, staff hirings, and firings, and other changes. Over the past 12 months, between 71 and 74% of staff, depending on level, saw an increase. The exception is chief executives, where only 61% saw an increase. As you can see, there's not a lot of variation in the average level of increase among levels. It ranged from a low of 2.7% among non-management staff to a high of 3.4% among chief executives. It should be noted that the average sector change includes those that did not receive a change. Looking ahead to the next 12 months, increases are expected for 69 to 78% of staff, depending on level. The exception again is chief executives, where 61% expect an increase. The average increases in the coming 12 months were anticipated to be lower than in the past 12 months at 1.8% to 2.6%. Also shown here are the same results from the 2024 study for your reference purposes. That's the orange bars. And at all levels, the actual increase from the past 12 months, which is the blue bars on the left graph, exceed the anticipated average increase from the last study, which is the orange bars on the right graph. Now let's look at how to use the data to establish a salary range. We'll walk through an example of how to take the benchmark information from the report and apply it to your own organization to develop practical, defensible salary ranges. The first step is to identify the applicable benchmarks for the organization and staff profile. In this example, Sophia is the chief executive of a registered charity based in the Greater Toronto Area. Sophia and her board have agreed to undertake a compensation review, and she needs to gather information to help them determine a competitive compensation package going forward. To do that, she turns to the 2025 Canadian Nonprofit Sector Salary and Benefits Study. And as a first step, Sophia creates a profile of her organization and herself. And in addition to what I just mentioned, the scope of the charity is local. It's a smaller organization with 4 staff and an annual budget of about $750,000. The charity is not formally affiliated with any other organization. And Sophia has 14 years of experience in her field and holds a bachelor's degree. She currently works in a hybrid arrangement, spending about 2 days per week in the office. So with her profile in hand, Sophia turns to page 72 of the report to reference the detailed benchmarks for the chief executive position in registered charities. She then identifies all the benchmarks that match her profile. There are 10 in all. Sophia also decides to look at the regional benchmarks. And on page 121 of the report, she finds the detailed table summarizing the benchmarks for the chief executive position in the Greater Toronto Area. And once again, she identifies the 10 applicable benchmarks in the GTA that align with her profile. To make the data easier to work with, Sophia copies the relevant data points into an Excel spreadsheet. And as a starting point, she focuses on total cash compensation, knowing that this is the ultimate benchmark she wants to use, regardless of how her organization decides to structure pay. But as she reviews the summarized table, Sophia recalls seeing something about quartile ranges in the report. And she wonders whether the benchmarks she's identified actually line up with those ranges and what that might tell her about the competitiveness of the compensation. So to confirm the selected benchmarks are appropriate for her organization, Sophia references the chief executive quartile ranges presented on page 70 of the report for registered charities and page 119 for the Greater Toronto market. Different organizations fit into different classes when it comes to compensation. The class an organization belongs to will depend on many factors, such as the profile of the charity, the constituents it serves, the type of work it does, the size of the organization, where it's located, etc. Organizations can generally be classified into 4 compensation groups or quartiles. The quartile ranges divide respondents into 4 equal groups according to salary. So 25% fall into each group. These quartile ranges should be used as a basic guideline in deciding the caliber of employee that you wish to attract and retain. Accordingly, they can be used to determine if the selected benchmarks and the final result line up with expectations. Based on her knowledge of the organization and her own profile and current compensation, Sophia identifies that her organization is about average in the world of nonprofits. It is small, but she feels it may fit into the third quartile. In comparing her registered charity benchmarks, she notes that all but 3 of the applicable benchmarks are in the third quartile for registered charities. The exceptions are the GTA market, which is well above the quartile range, and the 2 size benchmarks, revenue and number of staff, are well below. Given that most fit in that range, she feels comfortable with the registered charity benchmarks as a valid comparator for her organization. And while the registered charity benchmarks are important, Sophia is aware that geographic markets also play a major role in determining compensation. Accordingly, she compares the GTA benchmarks to the third quartile of the GTA. Again, she notes that all but the 2 size benchmarks for the GTA fall in the third quartile for the GTA market. So again, she's comfortable that the GTA benchmarks are a good comparator for her organization. Now that Sophia has her benchmarks, she can start determining an appropriate salary range for her position. When setting a range based on the benchmarks, there's no single right approach. The data from the report should be viewed as a guide, a way to help you make informed decisions supported by solid evidence. Setting a range is part math and part judgment. The goal is to arrive at a range that is competitive enough to attract and retain quality staff. In cases where you already have an incumbent in the role, it is important to consider the cost of replacing that person as part of your decision making. When deciding which benchmarks to give the most weight to, focus on the comparables of best fit for your organization. With that in mind, here are 3 possible approaches based on Sophia's chosen benchmarks, and 2 of them are just a variation of the same concept. The first approach is simple and straightforward. You identify the highest and lowest values among your benchmarks, and you'll note that we're not using the personal benchmarks at this stage because we're just focusing on the compensation range for the organization. In this case, the hybrid benchmark for the GTA-based nonprofits is the high at $168,920, and the 1 to 5 staff category for registered charities is low at $87,382. Together, these form your range, which, when rounded, is $87,400 to $168,900. And the midpoint between those numbers is $128,151. A slight variation to consider with this or any approach is dropping the original high and low values and using the second highest and second lowest instead. Typically, you'd only do this if the high or low values appear significantly out of line with the rest of the data, or if the range is too wide. In Sophia's case, while the high and low aren't extremely different from the rest of the range, they do create a very wide range. So she may want to consider this an alternative. If she does, the range would become 97,000, which is the 500,000 to $1 million in revenue for registered charities, to 160,300, which is registered charities in the GTA, which is shown in both tables, with a midpoint of 128,700, which is only slightly higher than the original approach. As a general rule, if you're dropping the low, you should also drop the high. The second common approach is to take the average of all your benchmarks and establish a midpoint, and then set your range using a percentage variation. Let's assume the variation for the range will be plus or minus 10% from the midpoint. We start by calculating the average of all benchmarks, which is $132,500 after rounding. Next, we calculate the 10% variance, which 10% of 132,500 is 13,250. And to determine the range, we simply add this number to the midpoint to set the upper limit of 145,750 and subtract it from the midpoint to get the lower limit of 119,250. The third and final approach is similar to the previous one. The difference is that instead of taking the average of all benchmarks, we take the average of the major categories, in this case, registered charities and the GTA, and then we calculate the midpoint as the average of those two category averages. Again, we'll use a 10% variance for the range. The average of the registered charity benchmarks is 119,172, and the average for the GTA benchmarks is 145,794. This gives a midpoint of 132,483, which just happens to be the same as the previous method. Now, in this example, because the number of benchmarks in each group are both the same, it's going to yield the same result. But if you had, say, 4 benchmarks in one group and 6 in the other, the results would differ. Now, this is the approach that we use for custom analysis, as it allows you to weight certain factors more heavily when appropriate. For example, in this case, you may want to give more weight to some of the Toronto numbers because geography does play such a big role. The ranges shown here represent the published ranges. Typically, an organization will hire staff toward the midpoint, with the highest point reserved for those who are senior in the role and performing consistently above average. Sophia's personal benchmarks, such as experience in education, would determine where within the range she falls. Benefits, if offered, are in addition to this. And at the chief executive level, benefits add an average of about $13,000 to the compensation package for registered charities. Using the report, you can use this benefit value as a guideline, either by determining which benefits fit within that budget or by adding that value to the cash compensation. There are plenty of other benchmarks in the report to explore, and for those who need more tailored results, we also offer custom analysis based on the raw data, providing more precise benchmarks for those or than those published in the report. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jack to tell you about building the case.
Thank you. Taking the information from the CharityVillage report, let's now explore the overall economic landscape and how it will influence what organizations will be considering as compensation budgets are developed for next year. We'll also identify how you can make the case for an increase to your compensation and what employers and employees should consider in addition to salary changes to reward employees. Looking toward 2026, one thing is clear. Uncertainty is the new normal. Global markets are shifting faster than many expected, driven by geopolitical realignments, policy changes, and uneven economic recovery. For employers and employees alike, the challenge isn't just predicting what's next, it's preparing to adapt. In the coming minutes, we'll explore how key economic indicators and compensation trends can help guide smarter salary and benefits negotiations in this unpredictable landscape. Economic uncertainty is slowing decision-making across sectors. Major spending and new projects are being put on hold while organizations wait for clearer signals. Canada's unemployment rate has climbed to just over 7%, up from the start of the year, but forecasts suggest it will stabilize through 2026. More than 60% of employers expect turbulence ahead, whether from a downturn or tensions with the United States. Yet despite limited wage growth, many employees are choosing stability over change. That signals a cautious job market, one where confidence is fragile, and loyalty is strengthening, meaning a lot of employees will prefer to stay in their current job. Several forces are shaping the uncertainty we're seeing in 2026. Unemployment remains uneven across the country, especially in regions tied to exports. In Windsor, joblessness is now above 11%. In Oshawa, close to 9%. Both cities are feeling the effects of restrictive trade practices that have slowed Canada's major exports, especially in automotive manufacturing. Ontario's overall unemployment is higher than the national average. Provinces like Alberta and New Brunswick are vulnerable given dependency on energy exports to the United States. Tariffs have driven a sharp pullback in manufacturing wage growth, and job openings nationwide have fallen to their lowest level in 8 years. With no shift expected in the United States administration's America First trade stance, Canada's labor market will continue to feel that pressure well into 2026. Inflation has finally settled into a more predictable rhythm. After peaking near 4% in 2023, it's now holding close to 2%, just slightly below 2%, right within the Bank of Canada's target range. Most forecasts suggest that stability will continue through 2026. The Ontario Ministry of Finance expects inflation between 1.6 and 2.5%, while major banks, including Scotiabank, are projecting around 2%. The only real risk to that outlook comes from external shocks, trade disputes, geopolitical tension, or new tariffs. If those pressures intensify, inflation could drift toward the higher end of that range, closer to 3%. Looking to 2026, most economists see modest but steady growth ahead. Canada's GDP is expected to expand between 1.4 and 1.8%, with inflation holding close to 2%, assuming no major global disruptions. Deloitte projects a gradual pickup from 1.3% growth this year to about 1.7% next year, as long as Canada retains its exemption from most U.S. tariffs. And of course, that assumption will soon be tested. The Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement comes up for review in mid-2026, and those talks could redefine trade conditions and Canada's economic path for many years to come. The first takeaway for us is that the starting point for employers in adjusting compensation will be the inflation rate, or CPI. That number, as noted, is now at about 2%. Unemployment has been trending upward through 2025, now sitting at 7.1%. Projections for 2026 vary slightly. Most place it between 6.5% and 7.3%. Some analysts, like those at the Royal Bank of Canada, believe we've already reached the peak and we'll see some gradual improvement. Others, including the OECD, warn the rate could edge higher before stabilizing. One area of particular concern is youth employment. Among Canadians aged 15 to 24, the employment rate has dropped to just over 53%, its lowest point in more than 2 decades outside the pandemic years. That decline underscores how difficult it's become for young people to find steady work in this cooling job market. Another takeaway or important consideration is this quote from Jamie Watt of Navigator, writing recently in the Toronto Star. He observes that high youth unemployment and the very challenging job market for otherwise qualified young people have historically been an indicator of a broader economic recession. What does this mean for your compensation planning in 2026? The consulting firm Normandin Beaudry's situational assessment for compensation in 2026 has 2 key messages. 1, employers are scaling back their budgets. And 2, adopting innovative approaches in the monetary and non-monetary elements of compensation will be important strategies to attract and retain staff. I'll speak to those elements of compensation in just the next few minutes. Compensation growth is expected to moderate slightly in 2026. Normandin Beaudry projects average salary increases of about 3.1% across Canada, down just a touch from this year's 3.3% forecast. The not-for-profit sector is expected to align closely with that national average. Increases will vary by region, ranging from roughly 2.7% in the Northwest Territories to just over 3.2% in Quebec. TELUS compensation data tells a similar story. Base salary growth across sectors is expected to average around 3.1% next year. Other surveys echo the same trend, slowing but steady compensation growth. Gallagher reports that average salary increases are expected to ease to about 3.1% in 2026, down from 3.5% this year, and nearly 3.8% back in 2024. The Conference Board of Canada projects a similar path, a 3.2% increase in pay budgets for 2026, following 3.4% this year. Alongside that moderation, overall employment growth is expected to remain soft, just 0.2% through late 2025 and 0.3% in 2026, reinforcing the picture of a cautious but stable labor market. Overall, compensation trends point to moderate growth in 2026. Salary increases are expected to average, as we've seen, around 3.1%, slightly above the 2% inflation rate, which remains a useful benchmark for planning and budgeting. Most organizations can anticipate increases within a range of about 2.7 to 3.2%. Of course, there are wildcards. Rising unemployment or a broader economic slowdown could soften those numbers, particularly for not-for-profits that depend on sector-specific funding or donor confidence. As employers face rising labor costs and an unpredictable economy, many are shifting their focus beyond simple pay raises. They're investing instead in their people through training, career development, and opportunities for growth. At the same time, with fewer openings and a cooling job market, competition for available roles has intensified. Here is quoted Laurie Whisper of Work and Rewards, and the publication The Hub suggests that these trends signal a new phase in the labor market, one where long-term development and retention matter more than quick hiring wins for the employer. Let's now draw our attention to how best to make the case for an increase to your compensation in this current market. When it comes to negotiating salary or benefits, it all starts with a clear career plan. Having a defined path for your professional growth gives you direction. It helps you know what to ask for, when to ask for it, and when it might be time to move on, to move up. In the charitable and nonprofit sector, these discussions often happen as part of the annual review process. Use that opportunity to talk openly about your goals with your manager and with others who can help you progress. A long-term plan not only strengthens your case for advancement, it shows commitment, foresight, and leadership. When you're preparing to discuss compensation, come to the table informed. Build your case with credible data from sources like CharityVillage, the Conference Board of Canada, or from us, the Portage Group. Then back that up with evidence of your own impact. List the ways you've added measurable value, especially financial results, such as saving or generating revenue for your employer. Remember, your employer has to justify any pay adjustment. The clearer you are about the value that you bring, the easier it becomes for them to find the budget that supports that increase. To negotiate effectively, you need to understand your market worth. Start by researching compensation trends and practices in your field. Monitor job boards to see what comparable roles are paying, and speak with recruiters or executive search firms who know your sector well. Just as important, understand where your organization fits in the broader marketplace. Are you in the lower, middle, or upper quartile for pay? How do its size, mission, culture influence compensation decisions? Knowing both your external value and your organization's internal reality gives you a stronger, more balanced foundation for discussion. When preparing to negotiate, it's essential to stay grounded in your organization's reality. Take a close look at its current financial position, the pressures facing your sector, and the needs of the communities you serve. Boards and leadership teams genuinely want to retain strong performers, but they also have to balance that against the expectations of funders, clients, and stakeholders who may be tightening their own budgets. Showing that you understand those constraints builds credibility, and it positions you as someone focused on sustainability, not just salary. When it's time to make your case, remember, no one can advocate for you better than you. Keep the conversation fact-based and professional. Personal reasons like higher living costs may be understandable, but they're rarely persuasive from an organizational standpoint. Instead, frame your request around what matters most to your employer: retaining strong performers, sustaining exceptional results, and avoiding the costs of turnover or recruitment. In every discussion, connect your value to the organization's success. That's how you turn a personal request into a business case. If your proposed increase can't be approved right now, don't view it as a closed door. Keep building your case with solid data, current compensation trends, market comparisons, and measurable performance results. Ask for feedback to understand why the request was declined, and, if appropriate, suggest proactive steps, such as a market review of compensation practices to help the organization stay competitive and avoid higher costs from turnover or recruitment. Finally, be ready to discuss alternatives to a salary increase, whether that means added benefits, flexibility, or professional development opportunities. Employers have options in addition to cash compensation. We heard earlier that HR experts recommend that employers also incorporate non-monetary benefits, and that may be an attractive strategy in a challenging economic market. I'll speak to these options in 3 tiers. Tier 1 is lowest with less effort. Tier 2 is moderate cost and moderate effort. And Tier 3, of course, higher cost and higher effort. Tier 1, you may be doing some of these in your organization now. Look to some flexibility around presence in the workplace. Of course, where you can, provide recognition, celebrate achievements. You can introduce or expand internal lunch and learn sessions, possibly drawing on such people as the organization's auditors or accountants, legal counsel, external consultants with whom you work, or subject matter experts within your team that can share their knowledge and insights with staff in other functional areas. Wellness breaks, loo time, recovery time for those extra hours put in. And taking a page from the corporate sector and publicly traded companies, perhaps the chair of the board with the CEO or executive director have quarterly Q&A updates where they're transparent with employees about the overall strategic direction of the organization and how this has meaning for all employees. Tier 2 has some ideas that have moderate cost for charities. Consider a stipend for continuing education. Depending on the number of staff receiving the benefit, it could be a few $100s, possibly more. Next, internal training. Give employees the opportunity to learn from more senior colleagues or staff in other functional areas. For a good number of years, some nonprofits have helped support employees with wellness workshops in-house, commuter allowances for public transit, and other interesting ideas. As noted, giving awards and making people feel special through recognition for extraordinary results doesn't cost a lot, but it has big impact for recipients. And think about other internal opportunities to help people contribute and develop skills, such as serving on an internal staff committee. Our Tier 3 ideas may require more effort and potentially a higher cost, such as a larger investment in continuing education and development. For example, is there a certification program that will benefit the employee and the employer? Sabbaticals are better known in academic circles in the public sector, but this may be an attractive option, particularly with a long-serving employee whom you want to retain, and having some time away for that employee to learn or re-energize will pay dividends. An interesting idea in the Portage Group's strategic planning practice with nonprofits takes a page from the Dragon's Den, or as the Americans call that show, the Shark Tank. Create a staff contest to come up with innovative ideas for your next strategic plan. Rewards for the best ideas could be a gift card or a half day of vacation. Our clients usually have a panel with the executive director and a couple of senior board members hearing the innovative proposals and deciding on the best ones. Lastly, an idea similar to a secondment is an organizational exchange. We've seen this more so in the association sector than with charities, where a government and association trade staff for a period to learn more about how the other works or to bring expertise to a project. Potentially, it could be an area where charities exchange staff. In my past, we actually had an IT lead and we shared that individual because we could only justify 50% of their time. The other organization also had a similar need, similar capacity. So the employee worked equally in the two organizations, bringing their expertise. If some of these tiered alternatives are too novel, remember there are fundamental alternatives to salary that you may consider, such as a title change or promotion, increasing benefits, such as an increase to pension, or provide more vacation. Even in the most challenging economic times and job markets, there are factors that are in your favor as a high-performing, valued employee. Employers need to consider what the cost will be when they lose a great employee. Recruitment costs are in the tens of thousands of dollars at the most senior levels. There is lost strategic momentum if the job sits vacant, and then add the time to get the new employee up to speed. The costs to replace are greater than the cost to retain someone. That is motivation for an employer to focus beyond just the short-term savings. Sometimes the best next step in your career means looking beyond your current organization. The reality is not all not-for-profits are positioned the same. Some can offer higher pay or more room for improvement and advancement. If you've reached a plateau with limited opportunity to learn or grow, exploring the market may be the right move. There's no cost to looking, and often change brings rewards, new challenges, new environments, and experiences that strengthen your skills and marketability. And yes, in many cases, a move can also lead to better compensation. The key is to approach that decision strategically with your long-term goals and career plan in mind. As we've seen, 2026 will be shaped by uncertainty, economic, political, and global. Yet within that uncertainty lies opportunity for those who are informed, adaptable, and proactive. For employers, it's a time to think creatively about total rewards, balancing compensation with culture, flexibility, personal development. For employees, it's a moment to take ownership of your value, know the data, set clear career goals, and approach every negotiation as a partnership built on facts and mutual benefit. Whether your path forward means growing where you are or seeking a new challenge, preparation is everything. Understand the trends, align your goals with your organization's reality, and keep your focus on long-term success, not just next year's pay increase. In an evolving economy, the most effective negotiators are those who combine insight with strategy and confidence with professionalism. That's how you turn uncertainty into opportunity. Let's now turn it back to Charity Village and to your questions.
Thank you very much for sharing these insights. So we will still have time for a couple of questions. So for the first question, were there any surprising findings in the 2025 data?
I don't know that it was such a surprise, but more of a realization this year that the salaries do generally pace with inflation. There's been a lot in the marketplace about trying to keep pace with the rapid inflation and people falling behind. And it was last year that we actually saw the big catch-ups. And I thought it was interesting this year that we saw a lot of them kind of level out. Maybe even dipping back below inflation so that, maybe they'll correct again next year.
Great, thank you very much. And for the next question, for the number of employees, does that value represent the total number of employees on the payroll or the full-time equivalents? I believe they're referencing the quartiles.
I believe that's so I think it's actually the number of staff, and in our example, we had quoted 1 to 5 staff. We use the actual number of people and not the number of full-time equivalents.
Perfect, thank you. And then for the next question, will you please share any high-level observations about the differences in the data for registered charities versus nonprofits?
Well, the simple generalization on that is other nonprofits, the salaries tend to be a little bit higher than registered charities. There are full benchmarks presented by level in the report. I don't remember for each staff level, but generally the other nonprofits are higher than the registered charities.
Thank you. And then for the last question, this individual noted that smaller organizations do not necessarily always have every level of staff, so they would like to know how to navigate that when leveraging the report.
So what we suggest when you're completing the survey, and it would be the same when you're interpreting the results, is you focus on whatever the role is that you play most often. So, I mean, if you're a CEO, but you're doing a whole lot of other, you don't have the support staff, but you're doing all the other roles, you are in fact the CEO. And that is the level that you should be reporting at, and that is the level that you should be comparing at.
Great, thank you very much for those insights. And thank you very much for presenting such an informative webinar today. Do you happen to have any final comments before we sign off?
I'd just like to thank CharityVillage for the partnership. I know CharityVillage is the 30th anniversary, and this is our 10th round of the report. So it's been very interesting to see this product grow, and not just particularly in the participation levels. And I'd like to encourage everybody to participate in the study so that we can have continue to have one of the most robust reports in the sector. And you can look for that in, I believe, in February of 2026 is when the survey will be done this year.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff and Jack. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the webinar recording. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues. The email will also include a survey link that you can fill out with your feedback on today's webinar. You should see a survey link pop up right here in Zoom following the session as well. On behalf of CharityVillage, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll join us for our next free webinar, Beyond Giving Tuesday, Turn One Day into Year-Round Support. You can find more information on this and all of our upcoming webinars at charityvillage.com/webinars. Thanks again for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.